We're back at the Guerrilla Logic World Headquarters with the newest old Guerrilla Logic employee, Ryan Knight.
Hello.
And
welcome, Ryan. Good to have you.
Thank you for inviting me out here.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming out all the way from Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
Salt Lake.
Yeah. So this is Drunk on Software, and today we're drinking coffee because it's early.
Way early.
Coffee.
Way
Too early
Or
for
water
software
for me.
developers.
Or water.
You better grab your water.
Oh, yep.
Your El Dorado.
So Ryan and James, and I think mostly Ryan, but I think you've both
Yes,
made
mostly Ryan.
contributions. Probably about a year and a half ago, launched a project, open source project called Anvil.
Yeah.
Crest Butte, Colorado is where it
Butte.
all started.
James helped me figure out the really hard parts, though.
No,
I did all
I did
the
nothing.
coding, but
That's,
I did all the coding, but he did the hard parts.
well, he told me he helped
He
me
wrote the
figure out.
tutorial.
I did nothing. I didn't write anything.
He helped me figure out how to write the hard stuff.
I'm just a cheerleader.
Okay, so anyway, why don't you guys take a swag at telling them what Anvil's about, the problem you guys are trying to solve, and the general gist of.
I think to look really high level, if you look at a large application, has lots of pieces, and a lot of these pieces are common across lots of applications. So what we wanted to do was create a high-level framework for helping you to build those applications. And there's things like the authentication
And
authorization,
authorization.
both, or you could just combine them into one word.
Some
And
kind of
access control.
in
Yes,
there. Yeah,
access
yeah.
and control. There are things like modular loading, so that you don't have an enormous Swift file on the client. Things like how do you do layout, how do you do control what users see on the screen based on their roles and permissions. There's how do you communicate across the modules. There is also navigation. How does the user navigate through an application? How do you do testing? How do you set up the development environments? How do you do builds? How do you do value object generation?
Wow.
So all these different pieces.
It's not that early, I guess.
That things
Going
like
off.
yeah, it's crazy.
So, a couple questions.
A lot of-
Wait, so what we want to do is there's a lot of Flex frameworks out there, but they address low level. How do I actually wire my UI together? Do MVC, whatever. But really, what we want to do is create a higher level framework to address these things, and it's called Anvil.
So from the Java world, a couple analogies. Tell me if these are accurate. But sounds a little springy, where I've got these different pieces that I may or may not need. I heard builds in there, so kind of got the app views.
kind of like that. Kind of a little bit of Spring and app fuse.
Yeah,
Definitely a higher level than like a struts or
yeah.
something like
We
that.
don't use that word at Gorilla, by the way. We banned it when you left last time to go build Anvil. I caught most of what you said in there. This is video, so they can rewind.
They
so
can,
we won't
they
recap
will,
it.
you should rewind.
But
right
one
now.
of the things that I wanted to ask about is modules. Is that, you said just to keep your Swift smaller, is that all modules are about, or is there other benefits to modules?
It's also about being able to roll out incremental updates to your application without having to change the entire thing.
Interesting.
So
Is there any security benefit or any?
There's security, and it also allows your development team to easily like split up the work. So an individual developer can work on a module in a very isolated environment,
right,
Okay.
and you can secure modules individually.
right.
So yeah.
And there's also the whole remote loading thing where with modules they don't have to live on the same server. You could load modules from any server.
It's really cool. Yeah, so failover, load balancing, whatever.
Interesting.
Or just, have isolated environments for testing or whatever.
Yeah. I think another part of modules is, one of the biggest pains of Flex development I found is compile times are enormous, especially as the projects grow.
This is I think a really interesting place where this type of like Anvil can really help a lot of people who are building these large applications. So there's one large Flex application that I'm aware of where the developers actually have two computers. And what they do is when they start a compile of the application, it takes long enough to do the whole build that they actually switch computers and continue working on another one until the build is done. So obviously Adobe's trying to address the performance problems with compiling large Flex applications. But what's interesting is that we can really, when we know how your modules and pieces of your application are structured, you've come up with some really interesting ways to optimize that in Anvil, optimize the compile times.
Yep, and you can also, it also breaks apart the project, so a developer working on this module can only compile its individual module instead of the entire application.
Right.
So,
Nice.
so you're not recompiling your entire framework every single time, which is a lot faster.
So jumping into those are some pretty big goals. I assume Anvil hasn't accomplished all of those yet, but
I think it's done.
It's
Is it
done.
done?
It's working.
No,
Shipped.
the first open source project you've heard of that wants no additional contributions.
That-
Anvil.
right.
No, we're done.
Yeah.
Assuming that you're being a bit bold in pronouncing it done by Monday.
Yeah, it
But
will be
it's
done.
90% done.
Okay. So we do need a little help, but you totally threw me off, and I had a real good question to jump into what Anvil is and why we care. But
Yeah.
or what it
So
does
really
today.
what it does today is it really does help people to build large applications and have a lot of the environmental things just there that they need. So like we talked about, modules is a big part of that, but the builds, being able to set up your Eclipse project files just by running an ant build, right? Being able to generate your value objects from your Java objects. A lot of that stuff is just there. The navigation is there. The inner portlet or inner module communication stuff is all there. So there's a lot of pieces that people can take advantage of today. It is being used in a number of places already.
Yes, it's currently being used at my past project with Williams gas pipeline.
Yeah.
They're using it, and it's the core framework for that application. So it is being used, and it's been tested and debugged. So
Yeah.
it works today. And
Stu Stern, would you like
We
to
have
make
a
a
special
guest
guest.
appearance?
Special guest Stu back.
Do you want to?
It's a little early to be drinking, ain't it?
We're
It is.
drinking
That's why we're
coffee.
drinking coffee this morning.
Do you want to give Ryan the congratulatory welcome back to the company hug on camera, or at least a handshake? This is a true moment.
Oh, that's sweet.
That almost made it in the camera, but they did hug. I will verify. We're learning about Anvil. and
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's okay. We don't.
We're
edit.
glad to have you.
We don't edit
That's
against Stu's better recommendations.
Glad to have the star of Flex Monkey back again.
Hello out there.
Okay,
in
you've
Trump
had your
Town,
time.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, he's the
Sorry.
CEO, so
Yep.
we do what we have to do. Man,
Recenter.
you guys have really thrown me off. So Anvil does the 3As right now.
it ties into Spring Security,
Okay,
formerly CG Security, to do all that.
that's good.
Is that free now? I mean, is it still free, or do you have to like
Uh-oh.
pay
We're
Spring?
gonna bash Spring. Sorry, Rod.
That's unknown.
Free. That part's still free, as far as we know.
Fantastic.
But I do appreciate Spring letting us know that the J2E app server's dead. But that's a whole other political rant. That
The king is
some other
dead. Long
time.
live the king.
Yeah, that's what Spring's app server meant to me. Anyway, so does it tie into like standard J2E security too, or
No,
just Spring?
just Spring.
Okay.
You could certainly extend it
You
to tie
could.
into.
Yeah,
It's a very flexible security model, so you can
Yeah.
plug it into really anything. But
and that's you provide support at all levels: the authentication, role-based authorization, and access.
yes, so you can secure like your remote services, individual remote services. You can secure modules and define, what roles can access individual modules
Nice.
and all of that stuff. So
Cool. And then you're giving, is it just the security support around modules, or is there also support for how those are loaded and when those are loaded?
you can secure actually individual modules, so individual users can't even load a module unless they have the proper access rights.
Nice.
So it completely blocks them from even accessing particular modules.
Okay.
So that's all in there.
Cool.
So what else does it do today? You talked a little bit about the compiler time, and you've got some solutions for that. Did you want to go more
Yeah.
into?
I
So-
think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so like at Williams, we were seeing compile times over, I think it was like over 20 minutes. it'd completely bog your machine down. You'd have to take a coffee break for 20 minutes.
A lot of caffeine.
Yes, yes.
One compile a day, that's kind of like the opposite of iterative development.
Yes. So instead of continuous builds, it's single build.
Wow.
Yeah, so to solve that problem, what we did is basically for each module I created a config file, and it's kind of like the Anvil compiler goes through and figures out what needs to be built, and then it puts it all into basically threads and figures out how many can be built at a time and what the dependencies are. And so like our compile times dropped to 3 minutes from 20 minutes.
Wow, that's awesome.
So it's a
So
huge drop.
you did some interesting things too, where I think a lot of the Flex compiler, what it's doing is actually reading libraries, SWIC files, and figuring out what's in those libraries, right?
Yes.
And if you do that for every single module you compile, there's a lot of
Huge overhead.
overhead there. So what
Yeah.
you're doing is you're loading those loading the SWIC files
Yeah.
into memory once, and then you
Reuse
do all your
it.
compiles.
Yeah.
And I think that was just brilliant way to optimize the compile times, because that seems like a lot of the overhead that the Flex compiler
That is.
doing.
Part of the problem with doing that though was, so the Flex compiler, is it the Flex OEM? They have like a high level wrapper around the compiler that they recommend you use. But the high level wrapper doesn't allow you to access all that stuff.
Interesting.
And so I had to go directly into like the MXML and CompC compilers to do
Wow.
this.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it was complicated, but the other advantage of that.
Isn't it great that Flex is open source now, so you actually can do that? It's not like this black box.
Yes, it's very nice to be able to get to that stuff, so you could actually see how stuff is working and get down in there. Yeah, because if you couldn't see the code, there's no way you could do this stuff.
Yeah.
That's cool.
But the other part of this, the other reason I did this is, in the future what I'd like to see is somewhat like Maven of being able to pull in your libraries from any kind of part of the network. Because the MXMLC and CompC have actually been written
Right.
such that they can pull their files from any network location.
Right.
But that's currently really not exposed or accessible easily.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so.
That is cool. So yeah, hooking that into Maven. So right now you've spent a ton of time doing the Ant builds for Anvil, but it'd be great to move it to like Maven archetypes and.
Yes, definitely. I think, Ant was kind of the best choice at the time, but today I think we definitely would want to redo it all in Maven. Ant has just become a nightmare to maintain. All
Yeah.
the build scripts are so enormous and
Yeah.
complex. So
Not Ant.
it just doesn't work right. You have so much logic in XML. Trying to do if and loops in XML
Yeah.
doesn't work. So
Interesting.
Oh, I don't know if I want to say that with the MXML paradigm, but
Well, the nice thing is that there isn't really conditional logic in MXML.
no, I know. And you guys have actually blended that paradigm quite well,
Yeah.
where you have the script blocks. It'd be cool to have
I actually
that
wish
in
that Ant had more of an ActionScript model where there was a procedural language backing the XML, and the XML was just declarative on top of that
That'd be really
procedural.
interesting.
It would
That'd
make
be
Ant, I
huge.
think, a whole lot more use.
it would overcome that problem of
Yeah.
trying to, because you try to end up writing scripts in XML and it's just
Yeah.
a nightmare.
So if you hate Maven and Ant, build James's build
That's right.
tool.
That'd be great. Let's do it.
So
Kind
so
of a
that kind of
mix.
moves into where you want to go with it. What other things are you looking towards to the future with Anvil?
Yeah, so today we have a lot of capabilities around generating like value objects, some capabilities around generating the services. I think what we'd like to do is, James was talking about, is using something like Maven to be able to generate a module. Maybe you put annotations on your classes. You can generate from your Java, generate your entire ActionScript side,
Right.
Nice.
the whole Flex
So
side.
things like being able to generate the service invocation stubs.
Yeah.
So like right now, when you make a remote object call, there is no client side interface to that server side object.
And
So
there's no
things
guarantee.
you can break pretty easily there. And
So
yeah.
it would generate my M and my C, and I'd write my V for the
What?
MVC. Sorry, I threw the. It would generate my model,
Your
objects,
model.
And
much of my controller.
I think you would generate the server interaction controller, but not necessarily the UI controller logic. You'd
Yeah.
still be writing that.
It's just-
So we're back. Reset. We lost a mic due to power problems, batteries. But we're back. So we're talking about Anvil. We're talking about large application frameworks, and we talked about generating a lot of the code that you're writing in Java in ActionScript, right?
Yeah.
And so where do we want? Where can we take this further?
I think the next step is to look at using something like people have been doing with annotations in Java, because Flex supports metadata.
Right.
You can write your own custom metadata. And then you had some interesting ideas with how you could do dynamic proxies, James.
Yeah, yeah. Dynamic proxies are interesting, especially when you look at like dependency injection, mock object testing, those types of things. Is that they require the dynamic proxy stuff, and there is no dynamic proxy support in ActionScript today. There's an open feature request for it. Everyone should go vote for it, but there is a possible way to do this using the self-hosting ActionScript compiler. So it's an ActionScript compiler that compiles ActionScript. So essentially what you could do is you could actually create your dynamic proxies in ActionScript, compile them all in memory, and then load those classes. So this is a possible way to get to today do dynamic proxies in ActionScript. That would allow us to do like mix-in, dependency injection, and style stuff that could be pretty interesting.
How complete is that compiler today?
For dynamic proxies, because they're pretty simple objects, I think that it will work fine. You know, there's no, these are very simple objects. You know, there's not a lot of complexity. So I haven't fully tested it yet, but it seems like it should work. It's not doing a lot of hardcore stuff. The one thing that I don't know about is if it supports metadata, and that would be. So I don't know if you need metadata on your dynamic proxies or not. So maybe we're good.
I can't help but ask, but should we expect to see any evolution in the ActionScript programming language?
Definitely. I don't know when, but
So not in 2009, it sounds like.
no, probably not.
Okay. Well, yeah, I assume it would evolve at some point, but I was kind of wondering in the.
We're definitely trying to think about the language features. We added vector support in Flash Player 10, and there were some other things in the ES4 spec, or are in the ES4 spec, that we still do want to add. One of the things that I'd like us to add is like real generics, like being able to take the vector notation to any object. And then also, I really liked Python's list comprehensions. I think that was something that they actually put into the spec that hasn't been implemented yet by the Xamarin virtual machine.
That'd be cool.
Certainly a better dynamic proxy API, a better reflection API would be nice too. Like there is, the only way to do reflection is to get an XML descriptor of your objects, and
it's very painful.
That's not like Java's method object, and Java has a pretty amazing reflection API.
Yeah.
So back to Anvil. Sorry.
Yeah,
You're fine.
that's a good.
Just
spec.
curious about when the.
So in terms of a use case when you'd want to actually use something like a metadata dynamic proxy, I was kind of thinking, one thing is like a complex workflow. So you have this huge workflow you want to do, and your Flex, you want to pass a model between all the different workflow steps. And you want to be able to wire the workflow together in different ways, and use the model at different points, and being able to dynamically wire that and control it.
Interesting.
Kind of like a spring or something.
Right.
Where you just kind of define, all right, I want this screen to this screen, and then automatically plug in my model to each step for me.
Interesting.
So.
Yeah, that'd be very cool. Inject the model in.
Yeah. So you're injecting your whole collection of array lists or something in, or so.
Yeah. Maybe your vector, so we don't run into performance problems.
Yes.
Yeah.
Don't tell the kids array collection's slow.
Yeah. So I think there's certainly a lot of things that we could do to just improve, create a more full solution for application development, and with Anvil, and I think we'd love to have contributions to
Definitely
that.
like some contributions.
You can check out Ryan's quick start tutorial and
Where's
get
that
started.
located?
We'll post a link because he's going to write it before we post this video.
Oh, fantastic.
But
It'll also be on my website, anvilflex.com.
yes,
So always go
put
there.
that.
Great.
So one thing I wanted to kind of ask Ryan before we close is you've obviously gotten really into the guts of Flex with
Too much.
Yeah. What I don't want it to be necessarily just the challenges, but really I think that's where people learn the most. So what challenges did you encounter with Flex, and where would you like to see Flex get better?
So, although somewhat controversial, I know, is we ran into issues with the date in Flex.
Yeah.
And Adobe's response was, well, use UTC, but my company didn't want to for their own reasons, right or wrong. And the date in Flex was actually final, so you can't change how the date works. And all we really want to do is be able to set the time zone on the date, so it's not the client, it's the server time zone. You can't. And so then, to overcome this problem, we tried to customize the serialization, the AMF serialization, and you run into this thing that, well, the object serialization is part of the Flash player and not in Flex, and so you can't override object serialization.
So you're forced to use date, which is final, and that kind of screws you.
Yes, yeah, and you can't, and so you run into, basically what you hit is this, like this proprietary barrier. Flex is open source down to the Flash player, but a lot actually happens to the Flash player that's proprietary and you can't override. And it really, that's the pain.
It's really frustrating when you're starting to understand what's happening and you're the debugger and then you hit the Flash class.
Yep, and that's the end of it.
Yeah. So like the two things I heard there were just some API immaturity.
Yes.
And then with the serialization, and I've experienced this and we talked about it in our talk on array collection, was we really need better hooks, right?
Yes.
To where we can intervene in that Blaze DS, lifecycle DS process.
Maybe we should use Hessian.
Well, there's always that answer, and that's what we get from the Linux guys. Well, if you just did X, you would have no problems. Yeah. Were there any other major ones?
Well, I think you pointed out one, but I've run into it as well, is that none of the collections in Flex have interfaces. You can't...
The superclasses do, so just before the yellow does.
There's
but
like
array
collection
collection
does.
doesn't.
Yes.
So it's very difficult to implement your own array collection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or make any changes to it, or...
Yeah, which I kind of throw that all under the API, just needing to mature more. I hope it's just mature, because I would assume that's normal. I wouldn't survive as an API designer, so I'm not attacking them, but it would seem that would be a pretty normal part of a collection to have an interface.
I haven't looked at it yet, but this guy Shashank Twani,
Yes.
he's been building an implementation ActionScript of Java's collections API. So I don't know if that helps us at all, or if...
I think that'd be very nice. I mean, part of that's a learning curve too. Like I got excited when I figured out how to make my own hash map class, but it's just because I didn't know Flex then and ActionScript, and it's like, oh, I can just do this on any object. But it's very nice for me to have my put and get.
Yeah, I've looked at some of those things, and you run into this limitation of, for some of those things you need some core capabilities in the language that just don't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, like generics and stuff that make it hard to write a good collection library.
Right.
Well, we all suffered in Java till what, 1.5?
Yes.
So that was a good 10 years. So maybe maybe Adobe can move a little faster, but whatever.
Yeah.
Those were the major limitations. So
overall, still giving Flex the thumbs up.
Really like Flex. In terms of development times, compared to developing, JSF, JSP, or struts or something, your development times are huge.
Well, in the end application.
Much faster. So
In my experience, the end application is so much better.
Much better. Looks a lot better.
Definitely the other one we can hit on that we talked about, but if we're grouping the challenges of Flex, is definitely the compiler. It sounds like you found some workarounds for that, but...
They're hacks, definitely hacks. Yeah. And you actually get into the core compiler, and there's some design issues inside of the core compiler. Like, the biggest issue I found with the core compiler is that you can't pass parameters into the compiler. The way they pass parameters in is using command line arguments. So you have to take your Java beans, translate them into like a string array of compiler options, the dash, what is it, external library equals, and you can't just say, okay, set my Java bean properties.
Wow. That's scary.
Yeah, so you run into there's some design issues that hopefully, they'll fix with Flex 4. But
we hope so.
We hope so.
Well, check out anvilflex.com and become a contributor, because...
Please do. Love to hear from anyone.
Yeah.
So, And thank you, John and James, for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on Drunk on Software.
drunkonsoftware.com. Next time, no cameos, but...
Next time, no Stu.
The no Stu policy is in effect. This means you,
The
Stu.
door will be locked.
But I know you don't watch videos, so...
All right. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.